The hum of the CDC's generators was the only sound filling the sterile halls, broken occasionally by the distant groaning of walkers beyond the reinforced walls. The group stood frozen in tense silence, the weight of Rick's decision pressing down on them. The doors had locked once more, sealing them inside. No fiery explosion, no hurried escape. Just the cold reality of what they had chosen. Shane's jaw tightened as he turned on Rick. "You want to tell me what the hell you just did?" His voice was low, dangerous. Rick met his glare, standing firm. "We have a chance here. Jenner knows more about this thing than anyone we're gonna find out there. If there's even a sliver of hope, I'm not walking away." Jenner sat heavily on a chair, rubbing his face. He looked exhausted, haunted. "Hope," he muttered. "That's a dangerous thing to hold on to in times like these." "You told us the world was done," Lori said, stepping forward. "But it's not. We're still here. And if there's anything, you've learned that could help us understand this virus, we need to know." Jenner exhaled, looking around at the expectant faces. His gaze lingered on Carl, the boy standing close to his mother, watching everything with wide, fearful eyes. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, then gestured toward the control panels. "Fine, I'll show you what I have." The group followed him into the main research lab, its once bustling workstations now eerily vacant. Jenner pulled up grainy footage on a screen, brain scans, cellular breakdowns, the slow and inevitable transformation of the infected. "This is what happens when you die," he murmured. "The virus reanimates the brainstem, takes control of basic motor functions. There's nothing left of the person they were." "You said there was no cure," Glenn said. "But what about slowing it down? Stopping it from spreading?" Jenner hesitated. There were theories, environmental factors. Cold temperatures seemed to delay reanimation. Walkers exposed to extreme conditions showed sluggish movement, slower neural activity. But we never had time to test anything. Rick turned to Daryl. "That means we need supplies. Whatever's left of the hospital's research centers. Anything that could keep this place running and give Jenner what he needs to study this thing." Daryl gave a short nod. "I'll go. Take Glenn with me. We move fast. Quiet." Shane scoffed, shaking his head. "This is a damn death trap. We were lucky getting in here the first time. What happens when this place runs out of food? When the power finally goes? We should be finding a safer place, not playing scientist." "And what?" Rick shot back. "Keep running? Keep hiding until we're all dead anyway? If there's something here, something we can learn, we owe it to ourselves to try. And what if it gets us killed?" Shane's voice was rising now, his frustration boiling over. "Then at least we die trying to do something that matters." The argument was interrupted by a distant noise, something metallic, echoing through the facility. Everyone tensed. "What was that?" Carol whispered. Jenner's face paled. "The outer doors. Someone's out there." Daryl was the first to move, gripping his crossbow tight as he motioned for Glenn to follow. They moved cautiously through the dim corridors, the group trailing behind them. The security monitors flickered, showing shadowy figures outside. People, not walkers. Some were pounding on the doors. Others stood back, weapons in hand. "Survivors," Dale murmured. "Or raiders," T-Dog muttered darkly. Rick pressed his lips together, considering. "We don't know who they are." "We don't care," Shane cut in. "We ain't letting them in." On the screen, one of the figures stepped forward. A woman with wild, desperate eyes. She banged a fist against the reinforced glass. "Please, we have kids. We just need food." Rick's gut twisted. He knew what starvation looked like. He knew that desperation. But he also knew how easily desperation could turn to violence. "Rick," Lori said softly, "we can't just leave them out there." Shane's hand went to his gun. "We let them in, we sign our own death warrants." Before Rick could speak, the first shot rang out. Glass cracked as a bullet struck the reinforced window. The survivors outside weren't just begging anymore. They were taking. "Shit," Daryl cursed, pulling back. "They're armed." Glenn shouted. A second shot. The third. Then chaos. "Everyone back." Rick ordered. The CDC was under siege. Bullets ricocheted off the metal exterior as the group scrambled for cover. Jenner, pale and shaking, clutched at one of the computer terminals. "They'll get in," he whispered. "They'll take everything." Shane was already moving, rifle in hand. "Not if we take them out first." Rick grabbed his arm. "We don't know how many there are." "Don't need to," Shane growled. "We put them down before they put us down." "We don't have enough ammo for a standoff," T-Dog pointed out. "Then we make sure they don't get inside," Rick said, his mind racing. "Block the doors, hold them off as long as we can." But it was too late. A deafening explosion rocked the building. Smoke and debris filled the air as one of the emergency exits was blown open. Figures moved through the haze, armed, desperate, and ready to take what they wanted. Jenner, wide-eyed, reached for a small device on the desk. "If they get in, they'll kill us all. They'll take the research." "You thinking what I think you're thinking?" Daryl asked, eyes locked on the blinking red light. "The self-destruct sequence," Jenner confirmed. Rick's heart pounded. "You can't." "I can," Jenner said. "And I will." Another explosion. More gunfire. "Rick!" Lori screamed. Jenner's breathing was ragged, his face slick with sweat. He shoved a flash drive into Rick's hands. "Get this out of here. Find someone who can use it." "You're coming with us," Rick insisted. Jenner gave a weak smile. "No, I'm not." The building shuddered as the countdown began. There was no choice now. "Move!" Rick shouted. As fire swallowed the CDC behind them, the group ran. Not just for survival, but for something bigger than themselves. The night swallowed them as they ran, the distant glow of fire licking at the skyline behind them. The CDC was gone, reduced to rubble and smoke. The flash drive Jenner had given Rick felt like a lead weight in his grip, a final reminder of what they had lost, and what they still might find. Panting, Glenn glanced back, his face slick with sweat. "We barely made it." "We ain't out of the woods yet," Daryl muttered, scanning the tree line. "They could be following." Rick knew he was right. The raiders had been desperate enough to storm a fortified building. If any of them had survived the explosion, they wouldn't stop now. "Keep moving," he ordered. "We find shelter before dawn." The group pressed on, exhaustion dragging at their limbs. Carol clutched Sophia's hand tightly, her eyes darting nervously between the trees. Carl stumbled, Lori catching his arm before he could fall. "Just a little further, baby," she whispered, brushing his sweat-damp hair from his forehead. Rick's mind raced. They had nothing. No base, no supplies beyond what little they had managed to grab before the escape. And now they had a new target on their backs. If the raiders had seen Jenner hand him the drive, they'd know he had something valuable. "Where are we even going?" T-Dog asked. "Away from here," Rick said. "As far as we can get." "That's not a damn plan," Shane snapped. "We don't have food, we don't have water. Hell, we don't even have a place to hole up. You think I don't know that?" Rick shot back, his voice low but sharp. Shane exhaled through his nose, looking away. The tension between them had been growing for weeks, and Rick knew it was only going to get worse. Daryl suddenly raised a fist, signaling the group to stop. He crouched, eyes narrowing as he studied the dirt. "Tracks," he murmured. "Fresh." Rick's grip tightened on his revolver. "Raiders." Daryl shook his head. "Too small. Kids, maybe a couple adults. Headin' west." "Another group?" Glenn asked. Daryl shrugged. "Could be nothing. Could be something." Rick hesitated. They needed to get as far from the CDC as possible, but if there were other survivors nearby, it could mean potential allies, or another threat. "We follow?" T-Dog asked. Rick glanced at Lori, at Carl's tired face, then at the rest of the group. They needed safety, a place to regroup. "We follow," he decided. The tracks led them deeper into the woods, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The occasional groan of a walker echoed in the distance, but they saw none close enough to be a danger. Then, ahead, a flicker of movement. Daryl raised his crossbow. "Got eyes on something." Rick motioned for the group to stay back as he and Daryl crept forward. A small clearing opened before them. A makeshift camp. Tents, a dying fire, the remnants of a meal scattered in the dirt. And people. A woman knelt beside a young boy, her hands trembling as she wrapped a bandage around his arm. Another man stood nearby, gripping a rusted machete, his eyes darting between the trees as if expecting an attack. Rick and Daryl shared a glance. "Survivors," Rick murmured. Daryl didn't lower his crossbow. Or bait. Rick stepped forward, keeping his hands visible. "We're not looking for trouble." The man spun, raising the machete. The woman gasped, pulling the boy behind her. "Who the hell are you?" the man demanded. "Just people," Rick said. "Like you." The man's grip on the weapon tightened. "Ain't nobody just people anymore." Rick nodded. He understood that better than most. "You alone?" Daryl asked, eyes flicking to the shadows beyond the camp. The man hesitated. "Not for long if you're thinking about taking what's ours." Rick held up a hand. "We don't want your supplies. We just left the CDC." There was an explosion. "No shit," the man muttered. Saw the sky light up like the 4th of July. The woman studied them, her eyes lingering on Carl and Sophia. "You have kids," she said softly. "Like us." Rick nodded. "We're just looking for a safe place. Somewhere to figure out what comes next." The man exhaled sharply. "Ain't no safe places left." "Maybe not," Rick admitted. "But we still gotta try." The man studied him for a long moment, then lowered the machete slightly. "Name's Carter." "Rick." He glanced at the woman. "Eva," she said. "This is my son, Jake." Rick motioned for the rest of the group to approach. Shane's expression was wary as he scanned the camp. "We trust in these people now." Rick ignored him. "We can help each other." Carter gave a short, humorless laugh. "That what you were trying to do back at the CDC?" Rick tensed. "You were there. Didn't get close enough to get shot," Carter said. "But yeah, we saw." "Then you know what was at stake," Rick said. Carter's jaw tightened. "All I know is that place had power. Food. And now it's gone." Rick felt the weight of Jenner's flash drive in his pocket. "Maybe not all of it," he said. Carter's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" Rick hesitated, then pulled out the drive. "Jenner gave me this before he died. He said it had research, something that might help us understand this thing." Carter stared at the device. Then he laughed again, shaking his head. "You really think that matters anymore?" Rick clenched his jaw. "I don't know, but I have to believe it does." Carter sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "You're either the dumbest son of a bitch I've met, or the only one left who still gives a damn." Rick didn't answer, because, deep down, he wasn't sure which one he was either. Rick stared at the flash drive in his hand, feeling the weight of it grow heavier with each passing second. Jenner had died for this. The CDC was gone, reduced to little more than rubble and smoke, and now they were out here in the open, with nothing but the unknown ahead of them. Carter watched him carefully, his machete still loosely gripped in his hand. The woman, Eva, kept her son close, her eyes flicking between Rick's group and the trees beyond them. Shane let out a sharp breath. "I ain't got time for this. We need to keep moving before those raiders pick up our trail." "And go where?" Glenn asked, his voice tight with exhaustion. "We don't even know what's waiting for us out there." Shane's glare snapped to him. "What's waiting for us is death if we stay in one place too long." "He's right," Daryl muttered, shifting his grip on his crossbow. "We're sitting ducks out here." Rick turned his attention back to Carter. "You said there's no safe places left, but you've made it this far. Where were you headed?" Carter exhaled, glancing at Eva before answering. "There was talk of a settlement west of here. Some folks claimed it was a military outpost. Others said it was just a bunch of survivors building something new. Either way, we figured it was worth checking out." Rick considered that. A settlement meant supplies, security, maybe even doctors who could make sense of what Jenner had given him. But it also meant risk. If it wasn't real, or worse, if it had already fallen. they'd be wasting time they didn't have. "How far?" he asked. 3 days, maybe 4, Carter said. "Depends on how many walkers we run into. Or worse," Eva murmured, her grip tightening on her son's arm. Rick glanced at Lori, at Carl, then at the others. They were exhausted, running on fumes. They needed a plan, and this was the closest thing to one they had. "We go west," he decided. Shane scoffed. "Just like that? We don't know these people, Rick." "And they don't know us," Rick shot back. "But we're all running from the same thing." Shane looked away, jaw tight, but said nothing more. Carter sighed. "All right then, we leave at first light." The group settled in for the night, taking turns keeping watch. The woods were eerily silent, save for the occasional distant groan of a walker. Rick sat near the dying fire, the flash drive still clutched in his hand. Lori sat down beside him, her voice soft. "You think this place Carter mentioned is real?" Rick stared into the flames before answering. "I don't know, but I have to believe there's something out there worth finding." She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "Just don't let hope get us killed." Rick wasn't sure he had a choice. As dawn broke, they moved out, keeping a steady but cautious pace. The forest stretched endlessly around them, the towering trees offering both cover and a constant sense of unease. Daryl took point, his keen eyes scanning the terrain for any signs of movement. Glenn and T-Dog stayed close behind, ready to react at a moment's notice. Shane remained near the back, his rifle in hand, his gaze flickering between Carter's people and the trees. "You really trust these folks?" he muttered to Rick as they moved. "Don't have much choice," Rick replied. "Yeah, well, I don't like it. You saw what happened at the CDC. People are dangerous, man. More dangerous than walkers." Rick didn't argue. He knew Shane wasn't wrong. The first few hours passed in tense silence, but by midday, the group was forced to stop. Sophia was struggling to keep up, her small frame trembling from exhaustion. Carol crouched beside her, brushing damp hair from the girl's face. "She's burning up," Carol whispered. Worry etched into her features. Rick turned to Eva. "You have any medicine?" She shook her head. "We ran out days ago." "Damn it," Shane muttered, pacing. "We can't afford to slow down." "We're not leaving her behind," Rick snapped. "Didn't say we should," Shane shot back. "But you know as well as I do, sick people don't last long out here." Carol's face paled, her arms tightening protectively around Sophia. Lori stepped forward. "There has to be something we can do." "There is," Daryl said, standing from where he had been kneeling near the tree line. "There's a town a few miles west. Might have some supplies." "Might," Shane repeated bitterly. "Or it might be crawling with walkers." "We don't have a choice," Rick said. Carter frowned. "Splitting up's a bad idea. So is letting a little girl die when we might be able to help her," Rick countered. Carter hesitated, then gave a short nod. "Fine, but we don't stay longer than we have to." Rick, Daryl, and Glenn broke off from the group, heading toward the town while the others set up a temporary camp. The streets were eerily quiet when they arrived, the buildings standing like empty husks of the world that once was. Daryl moved first, crossbow raised as he swept the area with sharp eyes. "Looks clear," he muttered. "Don't mean it is," Glenn said. They moved cautiously, checking each building for signs of life or death. The pharmacy was their best bet. The glass doors had been shattered, the interior ransacked, but there were still shelves standing. Rick moved quickly, scanning labels, stuffing anything useful into his pack. Painkillers, antibiotics, anything that might help Sophia. Daryl stood by the entrance, keeping watch. Glenn moved toward the back, searching through overturned shelves. Then he froze. "Guys?" Rick turned, following Glenn's gaze. A door at the rear of the pharmacy stood slightly ajar, dark stains trailing beneath it. A low, guttural noise rumbled from within. Daryl raised his crossbow. Rick approached the door carefully, pushing it open with the barrel of his gun. The smell hit them first, rot and blood, thick and suffocating. Inside, A man sat slumped against the wall, his body torn apart. But his eyes, they moved. The thing that had once been a man let out a wet, rasping growl, its fingers twitching as it struggled weakly to move. Rick raised his gun. "Wait," Glenn said. Rick hesitated, looking at him. Glenn pointed. "Look at his arm." Rick frowned, stepping closer. The man's forearm had been crudely wrapped in bandages, but what lay beneath made Rick's stomach turn. The flesh had been cut away, sliced clean, as if someone had tried to remove the infection. Daryl exhaled sharply. Someone tried to stop it. Rick's grip tightened on his gun. The thing let out another growl, its teeth snapping weakly. Rick pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the empty town. Glenn swallowed hard. "You think it worked?" Rick looked at the corpse, at the desperate, failed attempt at survival. "I don't know," he admitted, but it meant one thing. Someone else had been here, and they had been trying to find a way to fight the virus. Rick stood in the dim pharmacy, the echo of the gunshot fading into the oppressive silence. The body at his feet was still now, but the implications of what they had just seen clung to the air like the scent of decayed flesh. Someone had tried to stop the virus. Someone had believed there was a way. Glenn exhaled sharply, rubbing his face. "You think they did this to themselves? Or someone did it to them?" Daryl crouched beside the corpse, nudging the severed limb with the tip of his crossbow. "Could be either. Some folks'll do anything to survive. Some others, they'll do anything to see if they can play God." Rick's grip tightened around the flash drive in his pocket. Jenner's research had hinted at slowing the virus, delaying the inevitable. Was this what that looked like in the real world? Desperate people cutting away infected flesh, hoping to cheat death? A noise outside yanked him from his thoughts, the distant crunch of gravel underfoot. Daryl's head snapped up. "We got company." Rick motioned for silence, his heart hammering as he moved toward the shattered front window. The sun had sunk lower, casting long shadows across the street. And in those shadows, figures moved. 6 people, all armed. Not mindless walkers, but living, breathing threats. The raiders. Glenn cursed under his breath as he ducked behind the pharmacy counter. "They must have tracked us from the CDC." Rick's mind raced. They couldn't go out the front without being seen. "The alley." He turned to Daryl. "Back way. Now." Daryl nodded and led the way toward the rear exit. Glenn grabbed a last handful of medicine bottles from a toppled shelf and stuffed them into his pack before following. Rick cast one last glance at the dead man with the amputated arm. The horror of it sat heavy in his chest, but there was no time to dwell. They had to move. The alley behind the pharmacy was narrow, lined with rusted dumpsters and the skeletal remains of abandoned cars. The air was thick with the stench of rot, but it was mercifully empty for now. Daryl held up a hand, signaling them to stop. He cocked his head, listening. The low murmur of voices drifted from the front of the building, getting closer. "They're checking the place," Daryl muttered. "Ain't got much time." Rick scanned the alley. There, a fire escape leading up to the roof of a neighboring building. It was rusted, the ladder half collapsed, but it might hold. "Glenn, go first," Rick ordered. Glenn hesitated only a second before scrambling up. The metal groaned, but it held. Daryl went next, moving with practiced ease. Rick was halfway up when he heard the first shout. "They're in the alley." A gunshot cracked through the air, striking the metal just inches from his foot. He hauled himself up the last few rungs, rolling onto the rooftop as another bullet ricocheted off the fire escape below. Daryl was already moving, scanning the rooftops for an escape route. Glenn panted beside him, clutching the strap of his pack. "They're not gonna stop," Glenn gasped. "They're hunting us." Rick knew he was right. The raiders had lost the CDC, lost whatever supplies they'd been hoping to scavenge from it. If they thought Rick's group had taken something valuable, they wouldn't stop until they had it. Daryl pointed across the rooftop. "There. That fire escape leads down to the next street. If we move fast." The door to the pharmacy's roof burst open. A man stepped out, rifle raised. "Got you now, you sons of bitches." Rick didn't hesitate. He fired first. The man dropped, blood spraying across the rooftop. But before he even hit the ground, more footsteps pounded up the stairwell. "Go!" Rick shouted. They sprinted for the fire escape, gunfire erupting behind them. Daryl was the first down, landing in the street below with practiced ease. Glenn followed, stumbling slightly as his foot caught on the last rung. Rick was halfway down when a sharp, burning pain ripped through his side. He gasped, gripping the ladder as his body screamed in protest. He barely registered the distant voice, Glenn's, shouting his name. He forced himself to move. One rung, then another. His vision blurred, but he hit the ground running, Daryl and Glenn flanking him as they dashed for cover. They didn't stop until they were deep in the ruins of an old gas station, the skeletal remains of fuel pumps shielding them from view. Rick collapsed against the wall, pressing a hand to his side. Blood. Glenn paled. "Shit, you're hit." Rick shook his head, gritting his teeth. "It's not bad." Daryl ripped open Rick's shirt, eyes narrowing at the wound. "Through and through. Ain't deep, but it's gonna slow you down." Rick clenched his jaw. They couldn't afford delays. Not with the raiders hunting them. Not with Sophia sick. Not with the flash drive still in his pocket. "Can you walk?" Glenn asked. Rick forced himself upright. The pain was sharp but manageable. "Yeah." Daryl handed him a strip of cloth torn from his own shirt. "Press this on it. Ain't got time to stitch it up now." Rick took the makeshift bandage, pressing it against the wound with a sharp inhale. Glenn shifted nervously. "We need to get back to the others before those guys decide to spread out." Rick nodded, pushing past the haze of pain. "Let's go." The journey back was slow, but uneventful. By the time they reached the camp, night had fully fallen. Lori rushed to Rick's side the moment she saw the blood. "Oh my God." "I'm fine," Rick said, though the exhaustion in his voice betrayed him. Shane wasn't convinced. "This is what happens when we go off chasing ghosts. We should have kept moving." Carol knelt beside Sophia, pressing a damp cloth to her daughter's fevered forehead. "Did you find anything?" Glenn pulled the medicine from his pack, handing it over. "Antibiotics. Might help." Carol's eyes shimmered with gratitude. "Thank you." Rick sank onto a fallen log, the weight of the day pressing down on him. The raiders were still out there. The flash drive was still in his possession, and the unknown settlement Carter had mentioned still lay ahead. Lori sat beside him, her fingers brushing his. "You're pushing yourself too hard." Rick exhaled. "I don't have a choice." She didn't argue. She just squeezed his hand. Across the fire, Carter watched them, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he spoke. "That thing Jenner gave you, you really think it's worth all this?" Rick met his gaze. "I don't know, but if there's even a chance it can help us understand what we're fighting, then yeah, it's worth it." Carter studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Then I hope you're right." The fire crackled between them, casting flickering shadows on their weary faces. Tomorrow they would keep moving. Tomorrow, they would chase the faintest glimmer of hope. Because in the world they lived in now, hope was the only thing left worth fighting for.